Peaceful August evenings when families were sitting down for dinner and kids were playing in their front yards. Detective Brian Hayes had been on patrol for 6 hours and his shift was almost over. He was thinking about getting home, maybe grabbing a burger on the way when he noticed a black Mercedes with a broken taillight turn onto Maple Street. It was a routine traffic stop, the kind he'd done 1,000 times before. Nothing special, nothing dangerous, just a driver who probably didn't even know their taillight was out. Brian flipped on his lights and pulled in behind the Mercedes. The car slowed down smoothly and pulled over to the side of the road, parking under a large oak tree. Everything seemed normal. Behind the wheel of that Mercedes sat Agent Camille Johnson, though Brian didn't know that yet. Camille was exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired. She'd spent the last 3 weeks working undercover, infiltrating a major drug trafficking operation that stretched from Ohio all the way down to the Mexican border. It had been dangerous work, the kind where one wrong word or one suspicious glance could get you killed. She'd just wrapped up the operation that morning, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. But even though the operation was over, Camille's body hadn't gotten the message yet. Her nerves were still on high alert. Her mind was still in that survival mode where every sound, every movement, every person could be a threat. That's what weeks of undercover work did to you. It rewired your brain, made you see danger everywhere, made it hard to switch back to being a regular person doing regular things like driving home. When she saw the police lights in her rearview mirror, her first thought wasn't worry. She was a federal agent herself. She understood traffic stops from both sides. She knew the drill. Pull over, be respectful, show your credentials, and everything would be fine. It should have been simple. It should have taken 5 minutes. Camille put the car in park and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The setting sun was in her eyes, making it hard to see the officer approaching in her side mirror. She could hear his footsteps on the pavement, steady and measured. She rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel where he could see them. That was protocol. That was what you did to make an officer feel safe during a traffic stop. Brian approached the driver's side window with his hand resting casually near his belt. He'd learned over his 15 years on the force to stay alert but not paranoid. Most traffic stops went smoothly. Most people were just regular folks who made a mistake or didn't realize they had a broken light. But he also knew that things could go wrong in a heartbeat. He'd seen the videos in training, heard the stories from other cops, so he stayed cautious, stayed ready. When he reached the window, he saw a black woman in her mid-30s wearing casual clothes, looking tired. The car was nice, clean, expensive. His mind started making calculations, the kind cops make without even thinking about it. Expensive car, residential neighborhood, late evening. Could be stolen. Could be drug money. Could be nothing. He told himself to stay neutral, to just do the job. "Evening, ma'am," Brian said, keeping his voice friendly but professional. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Camille turned to look at him, and for just a second, their eyes met. Brian saw something in her expression that made him tense up. She looked alert, focused, almost like she was sizing him up. He didn't realize that this was just how she looked after weeks of undercover work, that she was trained to assess people, to read situations. To him, it looked like she was planning something. "No, officer," Camille said, her voice calm. "I don't." "Your left taillight is out," Brian explained, his hand moving slightly closer to his weapon without him even realizing it. "I'm going to need to see your license and registration." This was the moment where everything started to go wrong, though neither of them knew it yet. Camille's FBI credentials were in the glove compartment, along with her vehicle registration. Her personal driver's license was in her purse on the passenger seat. She made a quick decision. Show him the FBI credentials first, let him know he was dealing with another law enforcement officer, and this whole thing would be over quickly. "I'm a federal agent," Camille said calmly, turning slightly toward the glove compartment. "My credentials are right here in the—" "Keep your hands where I can see them." Brian's voice suddenly got loud, sharp, filled with an edge of panic that hadn't been there before. Camille froze. Her hand was halfway to the glove compartment, reaching for her credentials, but to Brian it looked like she was reaching for something else. His training kicked in. The training that told him people kept guns in glove compartments, that a moment of hesitation could be the difference between going home to his family or ending up in a hospital or worse. "I'm just getting my credentials," Camille said, speaking slowly and clearly. Her heart was pounding now. She knew what was happening. She'd been through this kind of training herself. She knew that Brian was scared, that he'd misread the situation, and that scared cops made mistakes. Fatal mistakes. I said, "Keep your hands where I can see them," Brian shouted again, and now his gun was out of the holster, pointing at her through the open window. Time seemed to slow down. Camille's training told her to comply, to keep her hands visible, to de-escalate the situation. But she also needed Brian to understand who she was, what she was. She was FBI, she was one of the good guys. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Officer, listen to me," Camille said, keeping her voice steady even though adrenaline was flooding her system. "I'm Special Agent Camille Johnson with the FBI. My badge and credentials are in the glove compartment. I need to show them to you." But Brian wasn't really hearing her anymore. All his training, all his instincts, all the fear that every cop carries with them on traffic stops was screaming at him that something was wrong. This woman was too calm, too focused. Her eyes were too sharp. She'd moved toward the glove compartment too quickly. In his mind, he was seconds away from being shot. "Show me your hands. Now." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. Camille slowly raised both hands, palms forward, showing she wasn't holding anything. She could see the fear in Brian's eyes now. Could see his finger trembling near the trigger. She'd been in dangerous situations before. She'd had guns pointed at her by actual criminals. But somehow this felt worse because this was a cop. Someone who was supposed to be on her side, and he was about to make a terrible mistake. "My hands are up," Camille said slowly. "I'm reaching for my credentials now. They're in the glove compartment. I'm going to move very slowly, okay?" She didn't wait for permission because she needed to show him that badge. She needed him to see who she was before this situation spun completely out of control. Her right hand began to move again, slowly, deliberately, toward the glove compartment release. Brian's world narrowed to a tunnel. All he could see was her hand moving toward that glove compartment where there could be anything. A gun, a knife, something. His training echoed in his head. Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. That's what they said at the academy. That's what older cops told rookies. "When in doubt, when scared, protect yourself first. I'm FBI," Camille said one more time, her voice louder now, more urgent. Her fingers touched the glove compartment latch. "I'm reaching for my—" The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful evening like breaking glass. 3 shots in rapid succession, so quick they almost sounded like one. The muzzle flash lit up the interior of the car. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Birds scattered from the oak tree overhead, their wings beating frantically against the darkening sky. Camille felt the impact before she heard the sound. The first bullet missed, punching through the headrest beside her. The second shattered the window, spraying glass across her lap. The third found its target, slamming into her left shoulder with a force that spun her sideways against the car door. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, spreading from her shoulder down her arm and across her chest like wildfire. She tried to speak, tried to tell him again that she was FBI, but the words wouldn't come. The glove compartment had popped open from her last movement before the shots, and now her credentials spilled out, falling onto the passenger seat and floor. The gold badge caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming there where Brian couldn't see it yet. Camille's vision started to blur. She could feel warmth spreading across her chest, soaking into her shirt. Blood. A lot of blood. She'd been shot before in training scenarios wearing protective gear, but this was different. This was real. This was her life pouring out of her body onto the leather seat of her car. Brian stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. His gun was still raised, still pointing at the woman in the car who was now slumped against the door, not moving the way she'd been moving before. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon steady. "Shots fired. Shots fired," he screamed into his radio, his voice high and panicked. "Officer needs assistance." "Maple Street. Send an ambulance." He approached the car carefully, his gun still drawn, still not sure if she was a threat. When he got close enough to look through the shattered window, he saw her properly for the first time, saw the blood, saw her face. He twisted in pain, saw her hand, now lying limp on the passenger seat next to a gold badge that was catching the dying light. An FBI badge. Brian's stomach dropped. His legs almost gave out beneath him. He looked down at the badge, then at the woman who was bleeding and barely conscious, then back at the badge. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation seemed to glow in the twilight, accusing him, condemning him. No. he whispered. No, no, no. He holstered his weapon and yanked open the car door. Camille fell partially out of the car, held in only by her seatbelt. Her eyes fluttered open, looking up at him with an expression that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was worse. It was disappointment. It was the look of someone who'd spent their entire career fighting for justice, only to become a victim of the very system they'd sworn to protect. FBI, Camille managed to whisper, blood on her lips. I told you I was FBI. Brian pressed his hands against her shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was so much blood. It was everywhere, warm and sticky on his hands. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching, getting louder with each passing second. Neighbors were coming out of their houses now, drawn by the sound of gunshots in their quiet neighborhood. Hang on, Brian said, his voice breaking. Just hang on. Help is coming. But even as he said it, even as he tried to keep pressure on the wound, he knew that help coming wouldn't change what he'd done. It wouldn't change the fact that he'd shot a federal agent during a routine traffic stop. It wouldn't change the fact that he'd seen a black woman in an expensive car and let his fear and assumptions override his training and common sense. The first patrol car arrived within minutes, followed quickly by an ambulance. The paramedics pushed Brian aside and went to work on Camille, their hands moving quickly and efficiently as they assessed her injuries. One of them, a veteran who'd seen plenty of gunshot wounds, looked up at Brian with disgust written clearly on his face. She's FBI, the paramedic said flatly. Did you know that before you shot her? Brian couldn't answer. He just stood there, his hands covered in Camille's blood, watching as they loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her toward the ambulance. Her FBI credentials lay on the ground where they'd fallen, scattered on the pavement next to the Mercedes like autumn leaves. As the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing and sirens wailing, Brian sank down onto the curb and put his head in his hands. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. But more than that, he'd almost killed someone who'd dedicated their life to the same principles he claimed to uphold. He'd seen a threat where there was none. He'd seen color instead of a person. He'd seen his own fear instead of the truth, and now, a federal agent was fighting for her life because of a broken taillight and a split-second decision that never should have been made. The ambulance screamed through the streets of Riverside, weaving between cars as the paramedics fought to keep Camille alive. Her blood pressure was dropping fast, and the lead paramedic, a woman named Rita who'd been doing this job for 20 years, knew they were in a race against time. She'd seen plenty of gunshot wounds in her career, but something about this one hit different. Maybe it was the FBI badge they'd found at the scene. Maybe it was the look of betrayal she'd seen in the victim's eyes before she lost consciousness. Stay with me, Agent Johnson, Rita said, checking the IV line for the third time. You're going to make it through this. You hear me? But Camille couldn't hear her anymore. She was floating somewhere between consciousness and darkness, her mind replaying the moment over and over, the sound of her own voice saying, I'm FBI, the fear in the officer's eyes, the muzzle flash, the impact. She'd survived 3 weeks undercover with drug dealers who would have killed her without a second thought, only to be shot by a cop during a traffic stop in her own neighborhood. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay at County General Hospital with a screech of tires. The trauma team was already waiting, having been called ahead by Rita. They moved like a well-oiled machine, transferring Camille from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed and rushing her toward the operating room. A nurse cut away her blood-soaked shirt, revealing the entry wound in her shoulder. The bullet had missed her heart and lungs, but it had torn through muscle and tissue, and she was bleeding internally. Dr. Helen Park, the trauma surgeon on duty that night, scrubbed in quickly. She'd operated on gunshot victims before, but when the nurse told her the patient was an FBI agent shot by a police officer, she felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just another case. This was going to be national news. This was going to be a nightmare of politics and public outrage. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, she had a woman dying on her table and her job was to save her life. Let's go to work, people, Dr. Park said as the team gathered around the operating table. I don't care who she is or how she got here. She's a patient who needs our help. That's all that matters right now. While Camille was fighting for her life in surgery, Brian Hayes sat in the back of a patrol car outside the hospital, still covered in her blood. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His partner, Officer Tommy Chen, had driven him there and was now standing guard, making sure nobody bothered him. But Tommy didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who just shot a federal agent? I told her to keep her hands up, Brian kept muttering, staring at his bloody hands. She was reaching for something. I thought she had a gun. Don't say anything else, Tommy warned him quietly. The union rep is on the way. You need a lawyer, Brian. This is bad. This is really bad. Brian knew it was bad. He didn't need Tommy to tell him that. He could see it in the way the other officers looked at him when they arrived at the scene. He could hear it in the dispatcher's voice when she confirmed that the victim was indeed a federal agent. He could feel it in his gut, that sick, twisting feeling that told him his life would never be the same. Inside the hospital, FBI special agent in charge, Robert Chen was storming through the entrance with 4 other agents behind him. He'd gotten the call 30 minutes ago while having dinner with his family. One of his agents had been shot. One of his best agents, Camille Johnson, who'd just successfully completed a 3-week undercover operation that had taken down a major drug trafficking network. She'd done everything right, and now she was in surgery fighting for her life because some cop got trigger happy. Where is she? Chen demanded at the nurse's station, flashing his badge. The nurse, visibly intimidated by the group of federal agents, pointed toward the surgical wing. Operating room 3. Dr. Park is with her now, but you can't go back there. You'll have to wait. Chen wanted to argue, wanted to demand access, but he knew better. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started making calls, first to FBI headquarters in Washington, then to the local field office, then to the Justice Department. By morning, this was going to be a federal investigation. By morning, every news station in the country was going to be covering this story, and by morning, that cop who shot Camille was going to understand just how big of a mistake he'd made. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Park and her team worked methodically, repairing the damage the bullet had caused, removing fragments, stopping the internal bleeding. When she finally emerged from the operating room, she was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. She made it through surgery, Dr. Park told the gathered FBI agents. The bullet missed all the vital organs, but it did significant soft tissue damage. She lost a lot of blood, but we've stabilized her. The next 24 hours are critical. If she doesn't develop any infections or complications, she should make a full physical recovery. Physical recovery, Chen repeated, catching the emphasis. What about psychological? Dr. Park pulled off her surgical cap, her expression grim. She's going to need time to process this trauma. Being shot by anyone is traumatic. Being shot by a police officer when you're a law enforcement officer yourself? That's going to leave scars that go deeper than the physical wound. Chen nodded slowly. He'd seen agents retire after incidents like this. He'd seen them develop PTSD, lose trust in the system, lose themselves. Camille was one of the strongest people he knew, but even the strongest people had breaking points. As dawn broke over Riverside, news vans started arriving at the hospital. Someone had leaked the story, and now reporters were setting up cameras and microphones, preparing to broadcast this tragedy to the world. The headline was already writing itself. Cop shoots FBI agent during traffic stop. It had everything the media loved: race, police violence, federal agents, injustice. Inside the hospital, Camille woke up slowly, fighting her way back to consciousness through layers of anesthesia and pain medication. The first thing she felt was the pain, a deep throbbing ache in her shoulder that radiated down her arm. The second thing she felt was confusion. Where was she? What happened? Then the memories came flooding back, and with them, a wave of emotion so powerful it made her gasp. Easy, easy, a nurse said, appearing at her bedside. You're in the hospital. You're safe. You're going to be okay. But Camille didn't feel safe. She didn't feel okay. She felt violated, betrayed, angry. She'd spent 12 years as an FBI agent. 12 years putting her life on the line to protect people. 12 years earning the right to wear that badge. And it hadn't mattered. When it came down to it, all that cop saw was a black woman in an expensive car, and he decided that was enough reason to pull the trigger. Agent Johnson? Chen appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of relief and anger. Thank God you're awake. How are you feeling? Like I got shot, Camille said, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd had down her throat during surgery. How bad is it? You're going to make a full recovery, Chen said, pulling a chair up beside her bed. The bullet missed everything important. You got lucky. Lucky, Camille repeated bitterly. I got shot during a traffic stop and you're calling that lucky? Chen winced. Poor choice of words. I'm sorry. What I meant is, it could have been a lot worse. The doctor said if the bullet had been an inch to the right, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Camille turned her head to look out the window. The sun was rising, painting the sky the same colors it had been when Brian Hayes pulled her over. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. Where is he? The cop who shot me? On administrative leave pending investigation, Chen said. We've opened a federal civil rights investigation. The local police department is also conducting their own review. This isn't going away, Camille. We're going to make sure he's held accountable. Accountable, Camille said, testing the word. What does that even mean? He gets a slap on the wrist? A few weeks of paid vacation while they investigate? Then he goes back to work and shoots someone else? Not this time, Chen said firmly. Not when it's one of ours. Not when we have dashboard camera footage that shows exactly what happened. He's going to face consequences for this. Real consequences. But even as Chen said it, they both knew the reality. Cops who shot civilians, especially black civilians, rarely faced serious consequences. There would be an investigation. There would be outrage. There would be protests and demands for justice. And then, usually, there would be nothing. The officer would be cleared. The department would close ranks and life would go on. Except for the victim, whose life would never be the same. Down in the hospital parking lot, Brian Hayes finally left the patrol car. The union representative had arrived, along with a lawyer the police union had hired. They were telling him not to talk to anyone, not to make any statements, to let them handle everything. They were already working on his defense. Split-second decision, feared for his life, followed his training. But Brian couldn't stop seeing Camille's face. Couldn't stop seeing that look of disappointment in her eyes as she bled out in her car. Couldn't stop hearing her voice saying, "I'm FBI," over and over again. He'd shot a federal agent. Not a criminal. Not a threat. A federal agent who'd been trying to show him her credentials. This is going to be okay, his lawyer was saying. These situations are always tragic, but officers have to make split-second decisions. You perceived a threat and responded according to your training. Any officer would have done the same thing. But Brian wasn't sure about that. Would any officer have done the same thing? Or had he let his fear, his assumptions, his biases cloud his judgment? When he saw that expensive car, that black woman, did he assume she was a criminal before she even opened her mouth? Had he been looking for a threat and created one in his mind where none existed? Back in Camille's hospital room, her family had started to arrive. Her mother, Dorothy, a retired schoolteacher, rushed in with tears streaming down her face. Her younger brother, James, who worked as a civil rights attorney, looked furious enough to punch someone. They'd been terrified when they got the call in the middle of the night. Their daughter, their sister, shot by a police officer. "Baby, we're here," Dorothy said, taking Camille's hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines. "We're right here with you." Camille tried to smile, tried to be strong for them, but the tears came anyway. Not tears of pain, though her shoulder was screaming. Tears of frustration, of anger, of grief for something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was grief for the trust she'd had in the system. Maybe it was grief for the belief that her badge, her service, her dedication would protect her. Maybe it was grief for the naive part of herself that had thought if she just worked hard enough, did everything right, followed all the rules, she'd be safe. "I told him I was FBI," Camille said, the tears flowing freely now. "I told him multiple times. I was reaching for my credentials just like you're supposed to do. And he shot me anyway." James's hands clenched into fists. "We're going to sue. The department, the city, the officer personally. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened here." "It won't matter," Camille said quietly. "It never matters. How many videos have we seen? How many cases? And how many times do the officers actually face real consequences?" "This time is different," James insisted. "You're FBI, you're law enforcement. They can't sweep this under the rug." But Camille wasn't so sure. She'd seen how the system worked from the inside. She knew how departments protected their own. She knew how the blue wall of silence operated. Yes, she was FBI, and that might give her case more visibility, more attention. But would it be enough to actually change anything? Or would she just become another statistic? Another name, another story that people would share on social media for a few weeks before moving on to the next tragedy? As the morning sun filled her hospital room, Camille made a decision. If she survived this, and it looked like she would, she wasn't going to let this moment define her as a victim. She was going to fight. Not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been in her position and hadn't had the resources or the platform to demand justice. She was going to make sure that Brian Hayes faced the full consequences of his actions. And maybe, just maybe, she could help change a system that allowed cops to shoot first and ask questions later. But first, she needed to heal. First, she needed to survive. The physical wounds would close. The shoulder would mend. But the other wounds, the invisible ones, those would take much longer. Those might never fully heal. Outside her window, the news vans multiplied. The story was spreading across the country like wildfire. By noon, it would be on every major news network. By evening, it would be trending on social media. The court of public opinion was already in session, and the verdict was coming in fast. This was another example of police violence, another example of racial bias, another example of a system that needed to change. But opinions didn't mean much in the real world. What mattered now was what would happen next. Would there be real accountability? Would Brian Hayes face criminal charges? Would the system finally acknowledge that something was deeply, fundamentally broken? Camille closed her eyes, exhausted from pain and emotion. She had a long road ahead of her. Recovery would be hard. The investigation would be harder. And the fight for justice might be the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she'd never backed down from a fight before. And she wasn't about to start now. 3 days after the shooting, FBI Special Agent in charge, Robert Chen, sat in a conference room surrounded by evidence that would change everything. On the wall, a massive screen displayed the dashboard camera footage from Brian Hayes' patrol car. Chen had watched it at least 50 times now, and each viewing made him angrier than the last. The video was crystal clear. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no room for interpretation. It showed Camille's Mercedes pulling over smoothly. It showed her rolling down the window and placing both hands on the steering wheel. Most importantly, it had audio. You could hear every word spoken during that traffic stop. "I'm a federal agent," Camille's voice came through clearly. "My credentials are in the glove compartment. Keep your hands where I can see them." Brian's voice, loud and panicked. "I'm just getting my credentials," Camille said calmly. "I said keep your hands where I can see them." "Officer, listen to me. I'm Special Agent Camille Johnson with the FBI. My badge and credentials are in the glove compartment. I need to show them to you." Then the moment that made Chen's blood boil every single time. You could see Camille's hands clearly in the frame. Both hands visible, moving slowly, deliberately. She was doing everything right, everything by the book. And then 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Chen paused the video and turned to face the team of investigators he'd assembled. There were 5 of them in total, all experienced agents who'd worked civil rights cases before. This wasn't going to be a quick investigation. This was going to be thorough, exhaustive, and bulletproof. Because when they brought charges against Brian Hayes and Chen was determined they would bring charges, there couldn't be a single hole in their case. "Thoughts?" Chen asked the room. Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez spoke first. She was in her 40s, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience. It's textbook excessive force. She identified herself as a federal agent multiple times. Her hands were visible throughout the encounter. She was complying with his instructions. "There's no justification for the shooting. The defense is going to argue he feared for his life," said Agent Kevin Park, the team's legal analyst. "They'll say she was reaching for something, that he had to make a split-second decision. But that argument falls apart when you watch the full video," Rodriguez countered. Her movements were slow and controlled. She announced what she was doing before she did it. And she identified herself as FBI 3 separate times before he fired. A reasonable officer would not have perceived a threat in that situation. Chen nodded. "What about Hayes' background? Anything there we should know about?" Agent Park pulled up a file on his laptop. "Brian Hayes, 42 years old, 15 years with the Riverside Police Department. No major complaints, no disciplinary actions on record. By all accounts, he's been a decent cop. Until 3 days ago. That might actually make this harder," Rodriguez said. "If he had a history of excessive force or complaints, it would be easier to establish a pattern. But a clean record means his lawyers will paint him as a good cop who made one mistake in a high-pressure situation." "Except it wasn't a high-pressure situation," Chen said firmly. "It was a routine traffic stop, and he turned it into a shooting because he let his fear and his assumptions override his training." Agent Monica Lewis, who specialized in use of force analysis, had been reviewing police training materials all morning. She looked up from her laptop. "I've been going through the Riverside PD's training protocols. They have clear guidelines on de-escalation. on threat assessment, on when deadly force is justified. Hayes violated every single one of them. Can you put together a detailed report on that? Chen asked. We need to show that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a failure to follow training, a failure to properly assess the situation, and a failure to use the de-escalation techniques he was supposed to know. Already on it, Lewis replied. I'm also going to interview use of force experts from other departments. We need independent voices saying that Hayes' actions were unjustified. While the FBI investigation was ramping up, the Riverside Police Department was conducting its own internal review. But unlike the FBI's thorough approach, the internal investigation seemed designed more to protect Hayes than to find the truth. Detective Williams, who'd been assigned to lead the internal review, was one of Hayes' close friends. They'd worked together for years, had barbecues at each other's houses. Their kids played on the same baseball team. Williams sat across from Hayes in an interview room at police headquarters. The union lawyer was there too, along with the police chief, Captain Anderson. The mood was somber but not hostile. These were colleagues, brothers in blue, trying to figure out how to navigate a difficult situation. Walk me through what happened, Brian, Williams said gently. In your own words. Hayes looked exhausted. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Camille's face, saw the blood, heard her voice saying, I'm FBI. But he was also starting to build a narrative in his mind, one that his lawyer and union rep had been helping him construct. A narrative where he wasn't the bad guy, where he was just a cop trying to do his job and go home safe to his family. I pulled over a Mercedes for a broken taillight, Hayes began. Standard traffic stop, nothing unusual. But when I approached the vehicle, something felt off. The driver, she had this look in her eyes, like she was calculating something, planning something. It made me nervous. Did she make any threatening movements? Williams asked. She started reaching toward the glove compartment, Hayes said. I told her to keep her hands where I could see them, but she kept reaching. She said something about being FBI, but I didn't see any badge, any credentials. All I saw was her hand going toward the glove compartment, and I know that's where a lot of people keep weapons. So you felt your life was in danger? Williams prompted. Hayes nodded vigorously. Absolutely. In that moment, I believed she was reaching for a weapon. I had to make a split-second decision. It was her or me. The union lawyer, a man named Richard Stern who'd defended dozens of officers in similar situations, smiled slightly. This was a good narrative. This would play well in court if it came to that. Reasonable fear, split-second decision, officer safety. These were the magic words that had gotten countless cops acquitted in shooting cases. But what none of them knew was that the FBI had already obtained a copy of the internal interview. Chen had connections in the department, people who were disgusted by what had happened and were willing to secretly share information. And when Chen watched Hayes' interview, when he heard Hayes describe Camille as looking like she was calculating something, he knew exactly what was happening. Hayes was coding his fear, wrapping his bias in acceptable language. What he really meant was that Camille looked too confident, too composed, too unlike the stereotype of a submissive black woman. Back at the hospital, Camille was starting physical therapy. Her shoulder was healing, but it was a slow and painful process. The physical therapist, a kind woman named Ruth who'd worked with gunshot victims before, was gentle but insistent that Camille needed to work through the pain to regain full mobility. I know it hurts, Ruth said as Camille struggled to lift her arm. But if you don't push through now, you'll never get full range of motion back. Camille gritted her teeth and raised her arm another inch. The pain was intense, shooting from her shoulder down to her fingertips. But she'd survived worse. She'd survived the actual shooting. She could survive this. Between therapy sessions, Camille met with the FBI investigators. They needed her statement, needed her to walk them through every detail of that night. It was hard, reliving it over and over, but she understood it was necessary. If they were going to build a case against Hayes, they needed her testimony to be clear, consistent, and powerful. Tell me about your mindset that evening, Agent Rodriguez asked during one of their sessions. You just finished an undercover operation. Were you on edge? Of course I was on edge, Camille admitted. I'd spent 3 weeks pretending to be someone else, living with criminals who would have killed me if they'd known who I really was. You don't just turn that off the moment the operation ends. Your nervous system is still firing on all cylinders. But you stayed calm during the traffic stop. Rodriguez noted. That's my training, Camille said. Yes, internally I was still wired from the operation. But I'm a professional. I know how to control my reactions, how to present myself in a way that doesn't escalate situations. That's what made it so frustrating. I was doing everything right and it still wasn't enough. Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. Did Officer Hayes ever see your credentials? No. He shot me before I could show them to him. My credentials fell out of the glove compartment after I was hit, but by then it was too late. Camille's voice cracked slightly. I told him 3 times I was FBI, 3 times. But he didn't hear me. Or maybe he heard me and just didn't believe me. Maybe he couldn't imagine that a black woman in an expensive car could actually be a federal agent. This was the heart of the case, and everyone in the room knew it. This wasn't just about one cop making one mistake. This was about systemic bias, about assumptions and stereotypes that led to black people being seen as threats, even when they were law enforcement officers themselves. It was about a culture in policing that prioritized officer safety above civilian lives, that taught cops to shoot first and ask questions later. The investigation expanded beyond just the shooting itself. The FBI started looking into the Riverside Police Department's training practices, their hiring procedures, their track record with minority communities. What they found wasn't encouraging. While there were no other shootings like Camille's, there was a pattern of aggressive policing in black neighborhoods. Higher rates of traffic stops for minorities, more frequent use of force against people of color. Agent Park compiled all of this into a comprehensive report. This isn't an isolated incident, he told Chen during one of their briefings. Hayes might not have a history of complaints, but he works in a department that has clear patterns of racial bias. That culture, that environment, that's what led to him seeing Camille as a threat instead of a colleague. Chen knew this information was important, but he also knew they had to be careful. If they made this case too much about systemic racism, they risked alienating a jury. Americans, especially white Americans, were often uncomfortable confronting the reality of racial bias in policing. They preferred to see incidents like this as isolated mistakes made by bad individuals, not as symptoms of a larger problem. We need to thread the needle, Chen said. Yes, this is about systemic issues. But at trial, we focus on Hayes' actions. We focus on what he did wrong, on the specific choices he made that night. We let the broader context inform our understanding, but we don't make it the centerpiece. Meanwhile, in the community, protests were growing. What started as a small gathering outside the police station had grown into daily demonstrations with hue. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Riverside, Ohio, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was one of those, Sun said. Worst case, aggravated assault, civil rights violations. They could throw the book at you. The lawyer, Richard Stern, leaned forward. We're not there yet. The internal investigation is still ongoing. As far as the department is concerned, Hayes acted within policy. He perceived a threat and responded according to his training. But the FBI has that dashboard camera footage, Anderson said quietly, and it doesn't look good for us, Richard. It really doesn't look good. Stern waved his hand dismissively. Footage can be interpreted different ways. What looks like excessive force to some people looks like reasonable police work to others. We'll get our own use of force experts, people who'll testify that Hayes did exactly what he was trained to do. But Anderson wasn't convinced. He'd watched that footage too, and unlike Stern, he wasn't trying to defend anyone. He was trying to figure out how to protect his department from the fallout of one officer's terrible mistake. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that protecting Hayes might not be possible. The evidence was too clear, the FBI too determined, the public outrage too intense. As the investigation entered its 4th week, Camille was finally released from the hospital. Her shoulder was still healing, and she had months of physical therapy ahead of her, but she could go home. Her mother and brother picked her up, shielding her from the reporters who'd staked out the hospital entrance. How do you feel, Agent Johnson? They shouted as she walked to the car. Do you think Officer Hayes should be prosecuted? Are you going to sue the police department? Camille didn't answer any of them. She just kept walking, her head high, her jaw set. She'd give a statement when she was ready, when the time was right, but not today. Today she just wanted to go home, sleep in her own bed, and try to piece together the shattered fragments of her life. That night, alone in her apartment for the first time since the shooting, Camille stood in front of her mirror and looked at herself. The bandages covered her shoulder, but she knew what was underneath. a scar that would never fully fade, a reminder of the night her world changed forever. She thought about going back to work, about putting on her FBI badge and carrying her weapon again. Could she do it? Could she trust the system she'd served for 12 years? Could she work alongside police officers knowing that one of them had shot her and might face no real consequences? These were questions she couldn't answer yet. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let this break her. She'd fought too hard to get where she was. She'd overcome too much, and she wasn't about to let Brian Hayes or anyone else take that away from her. The investigation was still ongoing. The evidence was being gathered. The case was being built. And soon, very soon, Brian Hayes would have to face the consequences of what he'd done. Whether those consequences would be meaningful, whether justice would actually be served, that remained to be seen. But Camille was determined to see it through to the end, no matter how long it took or how hard the fight became. 6 months had passed since that August evening when Brian Hayes pulled over Camille Johnson for a broken taillight. 6 months of investigations, depositions, media coverage, and public outrage. And now, finally, they were standing in a courtroom where the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see. The trial of Brian Hayes had become one of the most closely watched cases in the country. Every major news network had reporters stationed outside the courthouse. Social media was buzzing with opinions and predictions. This wasn't just about one cop and one FBI agent anymore. This had become a referendum on police accountability, on racial bias in law enforcement, on whether the system could actually deliver justice. Prosecutor Angela Martinez stood at the front of the courtroom on the first day of trial, looking at the jury of 12 ordinary citizens who would decide Brian Hayes' fate. 7 women, 5 men, a mix of races and backgrounds. These were the people who would determine whether Hayes would spend the next 20 years in prison or walk free. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Martinez began, her voice clear and confident. This is a case about a police officer who failed in his most basic duty, to protect and serve. On August 15th of last year, Detective Brian Hayes shot an unarmed woman during a routine traffic stop. That woman was Special Agent Camille Johnson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was a decorated federal agent with 12 years of exemplary service. She had just completed a dangerous undercover operation that took down a major drug trafficking ring, and on her way home she was shot by a man who was supposed to be on her side. Martinez paused, letting her words sink in. The defendant will try to tell you this was a split-second decision, that he feared for his life. But the evidence will show you something very different. The evidence will show you a police officer who let his assumptions and his fear override his training, who saw a black woman in an expensive car and decided she must be dangerous, who ignored her repeated statements that she was a federal agent, who fired 3 shots at an unarmed woman who was complying with his commands. She walked over to a large screen where the dashboard camera footage was queued up. You're going to see this video, and when you do, I want you to ask yourself one question. Would this have happened if Agent Johnson had been white? Would Detective Hayes have been so quick to pull that trigger if the person in that car had looked like him? The defense attorney, Richard Stern, stood up quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecutor is injecting race into this case without any evidence that race was a factor. Judge Patricia Moreno, a stern woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, looked at Martinez. Counselor, do you have evidence that racial bias played a role in this shooting? We do, Your Honor, Martinez replied. We have expert testimony on implicit bias in policing. We have statistics showing that black drivers are disproportionately subjected to traffic stops and use of force. And we have the defendant's own words describing Agent Johnson in ways that reveal his biased perceptions. Then you may proceed, Judge Moreno said. But stick to the evidence, Counselor. Martinez nodded and continued her opening statement, laying out the case piece by piece. She told the jury about Camille's distinguished career, about the undercover operation she'd just completed, about how she was simply driving home when Hayes pulled her over. She described how Camille had identified herself as FBI 3 times, how her hands were visible throughout the encounter, how she was reaching for her credentials when Hayes opened fire. When Stern stood to give his opening statement, his approach was completely different. He was calm, almost sympathetic, speaking to the jury like they were old friends having a difficult conversation. Nobody wants to be here, Stern began. Not me, not the prosecutor. Certainly not Detective Hayes or Agent Johnson. This is a tragedy, pure and simple. But it's not a crime. Detective Hayes made a split-second decision in what he perceived to be a life-threatening situation. Was it the right decision? In hindsight, knowing what we know now, no. But we're not judging him based on hindsight. We're judging him based on what he knew in that moment. Stern walked closer to the jury box. Put yourself in his shoes. You're a police officer doing a routine traffic stop. The driver starts reaching toward the glove compartment. You tell them to stop, but they keep reaching. You have maybe 2 seconds to decide. Is this person reaching for their license or are they reaching for a gun? 2 seconds to decide if you're going home to your family that night or if you're going to end up in a morgue. He paused for effect. Detective Hayes made a mistake. He knows that. He'll have to live with that for the rest of his life. But making a mistake in a high-pressure situation doesn't make you a criminal. It makes you human. The trial proceeded over the next 3 weeks with a parade of witnesses and experts. The prosecution called the paramedics who'd treated Camille at the scene, the doctors who'd operated on her, the FBI agents who'd investigated the shooting. Each one painted a picture of an unjustified use of force, of a police officer who'd violated every protocol and training standard. But the moment everyone was waiting for came in the second week of trial, when Camille herself took the stand. She walked to the witness box slowly, still favoring her injured shoulder slightly. She wore her FBI dress uniform, the dark blue jacket with the gold badge pinned over her heart. Her medals and commendations lined the left side of her chest, 12 years of service on display for everyone to see. Martinez approached the stand gently. Agent Johnson, can you tell the jury about your career with the FBI? Camille spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. I joined the Bureau 12 years ago after graduating from the academy. I've worked in counterterrorism, organized crime, and most recently in narcotics trafficking. I've received 3 commendations for meritorious service and 2 for acts of bravery in the line of duty. And on the evening of August 15th, what were you doing? I was driving home from completing a 3-week undercover operation. See,